Hello and welcome to Haunted Montreal's Spooky Story Sessions. I'm your host, Holly Rhiannon, and today I'm going to tell you all about the old Montreal General Hospital. Here at Haunted Montreal, we bring you ghost stories in both French and English every Saturday. Now, before we get into today's episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell button so you get notified every time we have a new tale to share. And hey, if you're already subscribed, thank you so much. Welcome back. We're so happy to have you here. Now, without further ado, let's get spooky. Hundreds of elderly people live in a large, ramshackle building that sits on the corner of René Lévesque Boulevard and Saint-Dominique Street. Once Montreal's old General Hospital, the building is now called the Paul-Émile-Léger CHSLD, a government-funded home for the elderly in the northeast corner of Montreal's Chinatown. According to various sources, strange and possibly haunted activity is not uncommon in the establishment. Disturbing thoughts and visions seem to come out of nowhere. Some people report hallucinations. There are also sightings of a ghostly woman in an antique white dress and hat, not to mention a mysterious apparition who has been spotted sitting on the high rooftop staring down at people on the street below. Could these hauntings originate from the old Montreal General Hospital, which operated on the site from 1822 to 1953? Or might they derive from an abuse scandal that rocked the establishment during the 1990s when it was called St. Charles Borromée Hospital? A man who wishes to remain anonymous relayed to Haunted Montreal a strange experience he had in the old General Hospital during the early 1990s. He said that back in the 90s, his uncle had to be placed in a long-term care facility because he was beginning to lose control of his body and mind. He had just turned 81. His doctor recommended the St. Charles Borromée Hospital, which was basically an old folks' home in the former Montreal General Hospital. The location was ideal. At the time of their contact, the nephew lived downtown, so he could visit his uncle almost every day. He continued that he and his uncle had been very close. In fact, his uncle had helped his mother raise him when his father abandoned the family when he was just a baby. Placing this man in a long-term care facility was therefore done very reluctantly, but the uncle didn't seem to mind one bit. Ever the optimist, he suggested that he'd probably make a ton of new friends. The nephew visited his uncle every day, and after a few weeks he began to notice strange behavior. It was as though his uncle was being evasive or trying to hide something. The man wasn't sure if this was related to his mental deterioration or something else. According to the nephew, it was very weird. Whenever he asked his uncle if he had met anyone interesting, he would clam up. When asked about the other residents and the staff members, he would often shrug and not reveal any information, which was really unlike him in his younger years. Our contact attributed this to his uncle's dementia. Then, one day, out of the blue, his uncle would tell his nephew about a woman who he claimed would visit him every night. He described her as wearing a small white hat of some sort and an antique white dress with puffy sleeves. The nephew thought this all sounded really unusual, so he chalked it all up to being a dream. However, the man's uncle seemed to be getting more and more agitated by the day. He claimed that disturbing thoughts would enter his mind for no apparent reason. He complained that he would often have terrifying nightmares where an evil apparition instructed him to act in cruel ways. He mentioned that the woman in the antique white dress would often wake him up to help him calm down. The nephew thought that his uncle was probably beginning to lose his grip on reality with his advanced age. Regardless, he inquired among staff members about a possible woman wearing an antique white dress, and the staff claimed that there was no such person in the hospital at night and that it was just his uncle's imagination running wild. Then one day, something inexplicable happened. The nephew, being a curious fellow, was exploring the nooks and crannies of the hospital before visiting his uncle. Finding himself in an empty room, he was suddenly overwhelmed by a sweet, distinctive, penetrating odor. A cloud of fog began appearing in front of him, and as he inhaled, he began to hallucinate. The linoleum floor had somehow transformed into wood. Suddenly he saw blood inexplicably pooling around his feet. As the smell got stronger, he tried to run away, but his foot slipped in the bloody pool and he fell to the ground. As he hit the floor in a panic, suddenly everything reverted back to normal. No blood pooling, no wooden floor, and no weird odor. Disturbed, he continued to his uncle's room for a visit. On that day, the uncle was more agitated than ever. He told his nephew that he wanted to leave the hospital. According to the nephew, despite being frail, he was adamant. He told his nephew that the woman in the antique white dress had told him to move to another facility before it was too late. While explaining this, he was almost in tears, and following the bizarre experience the nephew had just had, he was resolved to get his uncle the hell out of there. 2 weeks later, in early 1993, his uncle left the hospital and moved into a private residence where he seemed much happier and more at ease. The nephew was pleased with the move despite the additional costs because his uncle reverted back to his usual, more relaxed state of being. He had no more nightmares, and the nephew had no more hallucinations. The mysterious woman in the antique white dress with the little hat was never mentioned again. The man may have gotten his uncle out of the St. Charles Borromée Hospital just in the nick of time. Before examining why, however, it's worthwhile to look at the history of the building. The Montreal General Hospital was probably one of the very few hospitals that was born out of bloodshed. During its planning stages in the early 1800s, there was a lot of animosity among stakeholders. Two gentlemen in particular, Dr. William Caldwell and Member of Parliament Michael O'Sullivan, were constantly at odds with each other. Dr. Caldwell was a Protestant and O'Sullivan a Catholic, two religions that were often in conflict. At the time, there was a bug-infested hospital on Craig Street that was unable to meet the needs of Montrealers and sick immigrants. Philanthropists like brewer John Molson stepped up to help fund the building of a new hospital. When authorities proposed staffing it with nurses instead of nuns, O'Sullivan actively opposed it in the legislature. He suggested the nurses would be too unprofessional compared with nuns, and that medical students would be allowed to conduct experiments on the dead bodies of the patients. Dr. Caldwell was outraged, so wrote an anonymous letter criticizing O'Sullivan. When O'Sullivan discovered who had written it, he challenged Dr. Caldwell to a duel in Pointe Claire, far away from prying eyes, as was the tradition during the era. The location was Windmill Point, a 0.1 hectare spit of land graced with a windmill that projects into the St. Lawrence River. The two men met at sunrise on Saturday, April 11, 1819, and stood 20 long paces apart with loaded pistols, as was the custom. When the signal was given, they fired their weapons at each other. After exchanging 4 shots of 28-gram lead balls and missing, O'Sullivan insisted on continuing. On the 5th round, both gentlemen were hit. Dr. Caldwell was hit in the right arm, and O'Sullivan was shot in the right side of his chest, just missing his heart. The bullet lodged into his spine. Both men survived what may have been the longest duel in Montreal's history. A decision was finally made to build the hospital on what was then Dorchester Street, today's René Lévesque Boulevard. On June 6, 1821, the cornerstone of the new Montreal General Hospital was laid. Designed by architect Thomas Phillips, the hospital was built 2 stories high with an attic and a basement. Perched atop the roof was a cupola. It was opened the following year on May 3, 1822. In the early days of its operation, the hospital had many problems, like low wages, a high turnover rate, and a lack of educated nurses. Medical treatments were often untested and toxic, and surgery was very dangerous because of the constant threat of fatal infection. Only about 25 surgeries per year were performed at first due to the risk of death. Patients were also given 4 to 8 ounce bottles of whiskey or brandy upon admission to help them relax, sometimes leading both patient and staff to get inebriated in the hospital. In one case, a blind man offered a hospital mate his bottle of whiskey from his bedside, but mistakenly handed him a bottle of laudanum, a tincture of opium. After taking a deep swig, the man overdosed and was dead within minutes. As the years passed, conditions began to improve, and the hospital was enlarged several times. New wings were added, such as the Richardson Wing in 1868 and the Moreland Wing in 1875. In 1894, a separate pathology building was erected. It was just behind the part of the hospital with the dome, which had been converted into a smallpox isolation tower. Many prominent medical personnel worked in the Montreal General Hospital over the years. Sir William Osler, who pioneered studies in pathology, conducted autopsies on the patients who had succumbed to their illnesses or injuries. Wesley Bourne became world famous after he pioneered techniques in anesthesiology at the hospital and introduced cocaine to patients. Sir Thomas George Roddick performed numerous amputations, while John McCrae, who would go on to pen in Flanders Fields during World War I, worked as a physician at the Montreal General Hospital and published manuscripts about typhoid and inflammatory disease. Despite being enlarged several times to a height of 9 floors, in the early 1950s, a decision was made to relocate the hospital to a larger site on the western slope of Mount Royal. In 1956, patients were moved to the new hospital on Cedar Avenue, where it still exists today as a sprawling medical complex. The old Montreal General Hospital was converted into a seniors' home. In 1968, it was transformed into the St. Charles Borromée Hospital for long-term care and adult rehabilitation. For decades, the hospital operated without any major incidents, but in 1993, rumors began swirling that some of the patients at St. Charles Borromée Hospital were being mistreated. Residents complained that some of the staff members were being verbally and psychologically abusive towards them. In 1999, a class action lawsuit detailing hundreds of cases was launched against the St. Charles Borromée Hospital. At first, the story was under the radar, but in 2003, family members of a patient there began secretly recording staff. They were able to verify ongoing verbal and psychological abuse against their relative. With this new evidence, the scandal exploded and the media began paying close attention. During the 90 hours of taped recordings, evidence emerged of the staff mistreating their relative, a 51-year-old woman who was left severely disabled after a car accident when she was just 18 years old. They called her a pig, told her to shut up on a regular basis, refused to bring her water, and teased the woman relentlessly by telling her a perverted man was fondling himself outside of her window. The tapes triggered then Health Minister Philippe Couillard to call a provincial inquiry into the conditions inside Quebec's nursing homes. On November 26, 2003, the embattled hospital director, Léon Lafleur, was found dead in a hotel room in St. Hyacinthe, 50 kilometers northeast of Montreal. He had committed suicide after writing a letter blaming the government for his situation. Following the inquiry, conditions improved, and the building was renamed Centre d'Hébergement Paul-Émile-Léger, perhaps in an effort to distance it from the scandal. 13 years after the launch of the lawsuit, the victims won $8.5 million. Now returning to the uncle who had paranormal encounters in the hospital. It would appear that his nephew got him out mere weeks before the abuse started happening. But who could the ghostly woman in the white dress and hat be who warned him to leave? One theory is that she is the ghost of Nora Gertrude Elizabeth Livingston, an educated nurse from New York City. In 1890, she agreed to accept a post at the Montreal General Hospital if 2 conditions were met. She demanded that nurses would no longer have to do housekeeping and that she would hire experienced personnel to open a school for nursing. Her requests were granted. After promptly cleaning up the wards and rearranging staff duties, Nora Livingston welcomed her first students on April 1, 1890. She was regarded as both strict and disciplined, but she took excellent care of her charges. While this does help shed light on who the ghostly woman might be, it does little to explain the nephew's bizarre and bloody hallucination. One possible theory is related to the fact that the Montreal General Hospital was one of the first to embrace the field of modern pathology. Modern pathology, a controversial new subspecialty of medicine, came into being during the second half of the 1800s. With the invention of the microscope, doctors could study microbiology in intimate detail. The study of pathology was controversial because it involved morbid anatomy. In order to try and learn more about diseases, pathologists conducted detailed examinations of the dead patients, including the dissection of their corpses. Dr. William Osler accepted the first pathology position at the hospital in 1876. The autopsy room was a small, dingy chamber in the basement with a wooden autopsy table. Dr. Osler worked tirelessly in this room, which was lit only by an oil lamp. Patients on the floors above often complained about the foul stench that emanated from this terrifying chamber. Remarkably, Dr. Osler conducted a total of 780 autopsies during his first 10 years at the Montreal General Hospital. Concerning the strange smell the nephew encountered, it may have been phenol, which was introduced as an antiseptic during the 1870s by Dr. Roddick. Previously, the first operating room was located under the hospital's cupola. It had a wooden floor and operating table that was encrusted with dry blood that was rarely scrubbed clean. Doctors usually wore old frock coats, which would become soaked with blood during surgeries and autopsies. At first, no attempts were made to sterilize the operating room, autopsy room, or instruments. So, Dr. Roddick introduced phenol, or carbolic acid, as a disinfectant in the operating room in the form of a cloud gas. A gallon tank of water was heated with an alcohol flame, and a bottle of phenol was attached to the system. The machine would create a cloud of antiseptic fog during surgeries. The powerful technique saw the mortality rate from his amputations drop from 80% to less than 4%. Concerning the hallucination, with the appearance of the otherworldly phenol fog and pool of blood, could the nephew have stumbled across some sort of paranormal autopsy or surgery? Finally, in the autumn of 2016, the establishment was visited by a medium who immediately picked up signs that the building was haunted. Upon closer examination, she noticed the ghost of a man perched high atop the roof, staring down at the people on the streets below. The medium was unable to describe him in any great detail, however. Who he is and why he sits on the roof are questions that still remain unanswered at the time of this video. To conclude, while the uncle passed away peacefully a decade later, his nephew would never forget the strange experiences he had in the old Montreal General Hospital, which left a lasting impression on him. Today, it is unknown if these hauntings continue at what is now the Paul-Émile-Léger CHSLD. Are you a Montreal resident or perhaps a visitor who has experienced something strange at the old Montreal General Hospital? If so, we'd love to know. As always, we want to hear your opinion on what could be going on. Thank you so much for stopping by. If this is your first video, we do hope you'll stick around for the next one. We post new videos in both French and English every Saturday. If you'd like to learn more about the organization founded by the talented Donovan King, it's all listed in the description down below, along with links to purchase tickets for in-person haunted storytime tours. Remember to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. We'll have a new video out for you next Saturday, but until then, stay spooky.